One dark night, Lucy and Jonathan were walking in the cool air near the edge of town. They had spent a wonderful evening together with some of their friends, but it was growing late, and Jonathan was walking Lucy back to her home. They decided to cut through a patch of forest. Though the path had long been forgotten, Lucy and Jonathan knew exactly where they were going. Along the way, they talked and laughed together. A branch broke somewhere in the forest, as an eerie feeling descended upon the happy couple. Jonathan and Lucy stopped in their tracks. "What was that?" Lucy asked. Jonathan looked around. "I don't know, but it sounded big, whatever it was." They listened intently, but heard nothing more. So they continued upon their journey, when they heard another crack. Whatever it was seemed to be pacing them. Jonathan raised his walking stick like a club. The tension grew ever stronger. Some bushes rustled, and then Jonathan shouted as a large creature leapt onto him and snarled and growled. Lucy ran and didn't look back. "I need to get to the police," she said to herself over and over again. She soon left the forest and found herself upon the town street. Lucy spotted a police inspector making his nightly rounds. She called out for him. The inspector stopped and waited for Lucy to catch up. "Inspector, my fiancée was attacked in the forest," she said out of breath. "Come, miss," the inspector replied, and they both took off into the forest. They stumbled upon a tragic scene. Jonathan laid upon the ground, covered in cuts, scratches, and bites. He was clearly unconscious. His walking stick was broken, and a silver knife glinted in the moonlight. "Lucy? Lucy, did you hear me?" Lucy snapped out of a trance. She was now in the clinic, just hours after the attack. "I'm sorry, doctor." "Can I see Jonathan?" Dr. Moss was very patient. "I'm afraid not at the moment. But the good news is, Jonathan is stable." Dr. Moss smiled. Then he changed the subject. "What exactly attacked him?" Lucy described what she saw and firmly added, "It was a wolf." The doctor thought a moment. "Are you sure? It's not common to find wolves in this area." Lucy nodded her head. Then the doctor reassured her, "Well, I'm sure the police will find the animal. In any case, I will come get you when you can see Jonathan." Lucy thanked him for his kindness. Dr. Moss then left the room. The next morning, Lucy found herself at police headquarters, along with Dr. Moss. She asked him to come along while the nurses looked after Jonathan. They were in a cold room, staring at a beast lying upon the table. Inspector Scrubb, the chief police inspector, was there. He was explaining, "We found this animal just off in the trees, not too far from the scene of the attack. It appears to have been stabbed. Is this the creature?" Indeed, this was the creature, and Lucy confirmed it. The beast certainly had some resemblance to a wolf, yet it didn't look normal. Dr. Moss commented, "You know, there's something not quite right about this wolf. It looks diseased. I think we need to examine it. We want to make sure Jonathan has not been infected by it. I'll send for my colleague and mentor, Professor St. Clair. He is more skilled than I am in animal pathology." "Very well, but I must ask that we all keep this quiet. We don't want the town in a panic." During the rest of the day, Dr. Moss examined the beast and extracted blood samples. The next evening, Professor St. Clair had arrived in town. He met up with the doctor at police headquarters. The doctor and the professor took a moment to catch up. Then it was straight to business. Inspector Scrubb and Dr. Moss relayed everything that had happened so far. So, this is the creature, Professor St. Clair said to himself. Dr. Moss explained Jonathan managed to stab the creature with his knife. Then, it wandered off and died, from what we know. The professor examined the wound carefully. Where is this knife? I have it right here. Inspector Scrubb gave the knife to Professor St. Clair. The professor took the knife and hit the blade on the edge of the table. A beautiful ringing noise reverberated around the room. Just as I thought. It's silver. Professor St. Clair turned to the doctor. Did you extract any blood? Dr. Moss answered and took up a vial of blood sitting on a little table nearby. There wasn't a lot left when I extracted some yesterday. Professor St. Clair carefully took the vial. He opened his bag and took out a bottle of clear liquid. Then, he mixed some of the clear liquid with the vial of blood. A few moments later, the color changed from red to sickly yellow. Interesting, he said to himself. You're right. This creature is diseased. It has lycanthropy. Dr. Moss and the chief inspector looked confused. The professor continued. It is also known as wolf disease, and I have no doubt that Jonathan is infected. How do you know? The clear liquid I poured into that vial is a concoction of wolfsbane, or the aconite flower. It will turn the blood yellow if lycanthropy is present. Then he said seriously, Now, what I'm about to tell you will be unbelievable and fantastic. I thought so too. However, I have learned much about this very subject which changed my views. This disease will cause the victim to become a wolf himself. If Jonathan is indeed infected, then he shall become a werewolf. Dr. Moss was silent, while Inspector Scrubb protested the possibility. The professor continued, I have more evidence that this wolf is cursed with the supernatural. You see, the flesh surrounding the knife wound is singed, as if burned. Silver and wolfsbane are the only things that can harm such a creature. He showed the wound to Dr. Moss and the police inspector to prove his point. Now, we need to get back to Jonathan as quickly as possible. If what I believe is true, we have very little time. Back at the clinic, the professor had already mixed Jonathan's blood with the clear liquid. Now they waited. In a few moments, the liquid turned yellow. The professor sighed. It is as I have feared. Please call in Lucy. She needs to know the truth. When Professor St. Clair finished explaining everything to Lucy, he then said, It is fortunate we made this discovery before the moon rises tonight. For tonight, Jonathan shall transform at the full moon. When that happens, we will only have a few hours to deliver the antidote. If we do not succeed when the moon sets, all will be lost, and Jonathan will never be free from this curse. Lucy wasn't sure if it was true or not, yet the professor was dead serious. Finally, she made up her mind. Professor, if what you say is true, I will do whatever I can to help my beloved. Good. We may need you yet. Now, we will need to get everything set up. The antidote will only work once Jonathan is fully transformed. Inspector Scrubb chained Jonathan to the bed to keep him secure, while Professor St. Clair and Dr. Moss carefully filled tranquilizer darts with the wolfsbane concoction. Lucy was then instructed to try and talk to Jonathan to help distract him, while Dr. Moss and the professor administered the antidote. Then the four of them waited. The full moon began to rise. Everyone held their breath and watched. Jonathan then began to convulse and strain against the chains. He sprouted fur all over and his clothes ripped. His face was disfigured, and in a matter of a minute or two, Jonathan had fully transformed. He snarled and snapped at the chains which bound him. No one could believe their eyes, yet here it was, just as Professor St. Clair had predicted. Lucy, though afraid, stepped out to the center of the room and began to speak. "Jonathan, it's me. It's Lucy." The werewolf focused upon her and snarled and spat, fighting against the chains. As Dr. Moss aimed the tranquilizer, the werewolf broke through the restraints and sprinted toward Lucy. Lucy got out of the way just in time. The werewolf tried to stop, but the momentum was too strong. It crashed through the window and fell to the ground below. Dr. Moss, Inspector Scrubb, and Professor St. Clair ran to the window. They saw the werewolf run off towards the forest. The professor cried, "Quick! We must follow him. Lucy, you must stay here." 3 men left the house and ran towards the forest. They searched the forest, all the while hearing a distant howling. After a couple of hours, Dr. Moss and Inspector Scrubb began to feel all hope was lost. "He's ran off. We'll never catch him now." "Nevertheless, we must try, or others could suffer his same fate," the professor said. They continued their search. Somewhere along the way, a low growl was heard. Dr. Moss raised the crossbow. The inspector had his pistol drawn. The tension was unbearable. In a flash, Dr. Moss was knocked to the ground as the werewolf pounced upon him. The inspector fired his gun, but to no avail. The werewolf then turned on Inspector Scrubb and knocked him down. The professor was frantically searching for a dart to shoot at the werewolf. As the werewolf went to bite the chief inspector, Lucy appeared out of nowhere and screamed for Jonathan to stop. The beast now turned towards her and charged at Lucy. She stood her ground, ready for impact with a crossbow shot. A dart struck the werewolf in the back. The beast collapsed to the ground. Professor St. Clair stood by and held the crossbow in his hands. "Are you all right?" he asked. Lucy looked shocked. "Yes, I'm all right. But what about Dr. Moss and the inspector? And Jonathan?" "Jonathan will be all right now. The antidote is working. See?" Sure enough, Jonathan was beginning to transform back into human form. As for Dr. Moss, he only had a few bruises, scrapes, and scratches. The inspector, fortunately, was only banged up. Jonathan hadn't bitten anyone. "Where did you come from anyway, Lucy? I followed you out here. I couldn't stand the thought." Her voice trailed off. Once Jonathan had fully transformed back into human form, the 4 of them took him back to town. Now dressed in new clothes and in a new room, Jonathan finally looked at peace. The professor withdrew another vial of blood and mixed it with the wolfsbane concoction. Yet the blood remained red. He sighed. Jonathan is cured, just in the nick of time. He also checked Inspector Scrubb and Dr. Moss just to be safe. All was well, and Jonathan would fully recover in just a matter of a few days.